You know how we often daydream about becoming a millionaire. We often fantasize about not having to pay rent anymore, not having to struggle to pay the bills, not having to work a 9-to-5 job. We can buy anything we want or go wherever we want. That's the life, isn't it? But being a millionaire is not always about getting everything you want. Though life is easier, some find trouble finding true love, someone who would love you even if you do not have the fame and fortune. This story is all about a millionaire's search for true love. Marcel Amphos is not your ordinary millionaire. In fact, one look at him and you would think he's a peasant. You see, Marcel lived like a hermit. If he goes out, he wore disheveled clothing, had unkempt hair, and had a toothless smile. He was not that good-looking too. People who had no idea who he was would not pay that much attention to him. While other millionaires would boast and show off their wealth, Marcel was very humble. Fame and glory were never one of his dreams. He did not need that. He was a very simple man who had very simple needs. All he wanted was love. For Marcel, he was happy and content having just the bare necessities, even if he could very much afford a mansion. He lived in a humble wooden cabin in the French Alps. As we all know, the French Alps is a tourist haven. The area is filled with resorts and ski systems. Marcel happened to own large tracts of land in the area, particularly near the village of Puy-Saint-Pierre. As tourists flocked to the area every year, the land rates increased, which also increased Marcel's net worth. Marcel wisely built houses in his land and rented them out. As Marcel's wealth continued to increase over the years, he never changed one bit and continued to live his humble life in his wooden cabin with his frugal spending habits and reclusive lifestyle. In fact, despite his frugal ways, Marcel was very generous when it comes to his family and friends. In the private land around his cabin, he decided to build a few simple chalets and had his relatives and friends live in them for free. It is no wonder that he is well loved by those who knew him. Despite his incredible wealth, friends and family started to worry about him. He was getting old, and his love life had been stagnant ever since Marcel was young. His constant disheveled state put off any potential lovers, and now that he is way past his prime years, they were worried that Marcel would not find love at all. Until one day, Sandrine de Villard, a businesswoman from Paris, showed up, wanting to buy a part of Marcel's property. As usual, Marcel refused to sell out. Sandrine was intrigued by Marcel and invited him to dinner. When Marcel introduced Sandrine to his family and friends, they were surprised. Although they were happy to see that Marcel was visibly happy with the presence of Sandrine, some could not help but raise some eyebrows. Sandrine seemed to live a lavish lifestyle. They were complete opposites, and they doubt that the relationship would last long. But unlike the other women who tried to date Marcel in the past, Sandrine stuck around longer than they expected. She was not turned off by Marcel's questionable hygiene or hermit ways. She did not even attempt to change him. Sandrine embraced him for the way he was, and for Marcel, that was more than enough. But despite all this, those who lived in Marcel's private village were still doubting the intentions of Sandrine towards Marcel. The friends and family of Marcel were very familiar with stories of gold diggers who scam old and wealthy men and women just to get a hold of their fortune once they pass away. They wanted Marcel to marry someone who truly loved him. Seeing the age gap of more than 20 years and the huge difference in their lifestyles, they doubt that Sandrine was the one. Despite all the opposition, Marcel decided to stick by Sandrine and fight for their love. Sandrine was also trying her best to win the villagers over. Sandrine could be the one Marcel had been waiting for a long time. One day, Marcel thought about how much his life has changed since Sandrine came along. He was suddenly sure about one thing. This was the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. And to the shock of everyone who knew the hermit millionaire, Marcel decided to propose to Sandrine. Of course, Sandrine said yes to his wedding proposal. Everything that has been happening was so off-character for Marcel that alarms started ringing for his inner circle. What if Sandrine pushed to be married right away? Just as they suspected, the wedding day came as sudden as the engagement. Marcel, who initially was mad at everyone for not making Sandrine feel welcome, sent out wedding invitations to their wedding by mail. The wedding ceremony was to take place in the village chapel, and everyone had been invited. When the big day came, all the villagers made their way to the village chapel, dressed in their best attire to support Marcel. Some of them were secretly hoping that Marcel would not push through with the wedding. There was no doubt that not everyone was happy as the ceremony took place, and not everyone was polite enough to keep their feelings to themselves as well. In fact, some people in the audience were jeering and booing the newlyweds as they exited the village chapel after their wedding ceremony. Marcel has seen how visibly shattered Sandrine was. He assured Sandrine that he loved her and that she was the love of his life. All the nasty comments and insults should not matter. They were married now, and nobody could do a thing about it now. It has been months since Sandrine and Marcel first met, but people still continue to refer to her as a gold digger. Sandrine shrank from all the disgusted and mean looks she gets every time she stepped out of the house. It became very difficult for her to live in the village with everyone hating her. Sandrine tried her best to live with the dreadful situation. One day, Sandrine and Marcel had a talk. She told him it was exhausting for her to live in the village, where everyone clearly hated her. Marcel naturally refused to move and be far from his family and friends. As the conversation went on, they decided to take a unique approach to their marriage. They decided not to live together. While it would take months for newlyweds to keep their hands off each other, the case was different for Marcel and Sandrine. It seemed that the two were completely at ease with this arrangement. When everyone heard of this arrangement, their hate for Sandrine definitely grew. If you truly loved each other, how could you spend life apart? The arrangement was not something as simple as Sandrine living outside the village. In fact, the arrangement was for Sandrine to go back to Paris while Marcel stayed in the village. When friends and family asked for reasons, Marcel said that Sandrine had to run a real estate business in Paris, while Marcel had to stay and overlook his properties. The new arrangement raised some red flags, and soon enough, it was the talk of the town. When the rumors reached Sandrine, she made sure to tell people that she just needed to tend to some business commitments in Paris. Besides, she could fly back to the village whenever Marcel needed her, and Marcel can do the same. The distance should not be a big matter. The locals were convinced that Sandrine left for Paris because she could not stand living in the simple wooden cottage, and she found it difficult to keep up with Marcel's hermit lifestyle. She was a Parisian. A year into their marriage, during one of Sandrine's visits to Marcel, she brought a bunch of her friends with her. They all went on a road trip to show Sandrine's friends around until they lost control of the vehicle. The accident caused Marcel to lose his life, and Sandrine was widowed. The untimely death of Marcel shocked everyone. The whole village and the locals in the area mourned for the humble millionaire that have touched their lives in his simple ways. A lot of people turned up to help with the funeral. Everyone was determined to give Marcel a dignified last rite. They decided to hold his funeral in the village chapel. Once the shock and grief wore down, Marcel's family and friends started to accuse Sandrine of foul play, and the villagers backed them up. It seemed like the locals could not wait to finally expose Sandrine once and for all. The accusations seemed to be far-fetched, but due to the number of people clamoring for it, an investigation took place. Despite the suspicions, Sandrine made a declaration. She claimed that she was the sole heir to Marcel's fortune. She claimed to have seen the will with her own eyes. To make things worse, Sandrine said that she wanted to evict everyone living in Marcel's lands so that she could develop them. Is this payback time for the bride, who had been treated badly ever since she came to the village? As the investigation on Marcel's death was taking place, rumors that Sandrine planned the whole thing all along were spreading among the locals. The fact that everyone else in the car survived the accident, and that these people were Sandrine and her friends, made it feel too much to be a coincidence. Because no evidence could point towards Sandrine, Marcel's family decided to seek legal help. The lawyers advised that if Marcel had any doubts at all about his wife, he would have left something to indicate so. After all, Marcel was a wise man. But the truth was, none of them had talked with Marcel since the wedding. Marcel was mad at most of them because they could not accept Sandrine. But despite this, the family went into Marcel's wood cabin and searched through his belongings. Sandrine clearly had not been there at all since Marcel passed away. Then, one of them came across a handwritten note scribbled at the back of an envelope. The relative looked it over and was about to set it aside when he noticed that the paper was notarized. The writing was clearly Marcel's, and it was just like him and his frugal way to write his will on the back of a used envelope. This was the holy grail that could save them from Sandrine's evil plans. Apparently, Marcel had some realizations and changed his will. The will indicated that all his money was going to its cousin. The renters who were living on his land will get the full legal rights to those properties. The family and friends could keep the cottages he built for them and the land the cottages were on, and the rest of his possessions were to be divided among his family. They could not believe what they just read. This was the ultimate gift Marcel left for his loved ones. There was not a dry eye in that cabin when they found the note. They knew they were indebted to Marcel for the rest of their life. As it turns out, Sandrine was not even mentioned in the will. Despite their hatred towards her, Marcel overlooking Sandrine surprised everyone. They knew how generous Marcel was and they were sure he would not leave Sandrine empty-handed. But this note says otherwise. There were a lot of questions. What did Marcel realize that made him change his will and leave out Sandrine? How did he figure out Sandrine's true nature? When the will was revealed, Sandrine did not take it well. She hired her own team of lawyers to verify the will and try to overturn it. She claimed that Marcel was so smitten with her, it would be impossible that she does not get a share as his legal wife. She even questioned the way the will had been casually scribbled in the back of an envelope. There was no way the document could be legal, but as mentioned earlier, the document was notarized. This means it is legitimate in any court of law. Sandrine did not back down. She said that the signature was forged. It was a long battle that Sandrine was willing to see to the end. However, in 2016, the court ruled in favor of Marcel's family. The will and Marcel's handwriting were declared to be legit. With this, all the villagers' suspicions were finally confirmed. They were glad that Marcel was able to realize Sandrine's true intentions before he passed away. Sandrine was left with nothing. This could have left a sharp sting for her knowing that all of her efforts to fool Marcel were all for nothing.